"You should have called before coming home," my daughter-in-law said through the doorbell camera while I stood on my own front porch holding 2 grocery bags and staring at a lock that no longer recognized my key. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had walked up to the wrong house. The late October wind moved through the maple trees lining the street, carrying dry leaves across the driveway Thomas had poured himself nearly 30 years ago. I stood there in my beige church coat with a gallon of milk cutting into my fingers and watched the little blue light blink on the camera beside the front door. The house looked exactly the same. The white shutters. The flower pots by the steps. The brass mailbox with Whitmore engraved across the front. But something had changed. Something cold. Something final. "Vanessa," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "My key isn't working." A few seconds passed before her face appeared on the tiny screen mounted beside the door. Her blonde hair was perfectly brushed, her makeup untouched, like she'd been expecting company instead of locking her husband's widowed mother outside her own home. "Daniel's at work," she said calmly. "And, honestly, Margaret, this arrangement hasn't been healthy for anyone." I looked down at my key in disbelief. Thomas had handed me that key the day we moved into the house in the summer of 1994. I could still remember him standing in the kitchen with sawdust on his jeans, smiling like a man who finally believed life might turn out all right. We had painted every wall ourselves, built every shelf, planted every rose bush by hand. And now I was standing outside like a stranger who'd arrived at the wrong address. "I live here," I said softly. Vanessa sighed the way people do when they're exhausted by someone unreasonable. "You've been very emotional since the funeral. Daniel and I think maybe some space would be good." Space. That word settled into my chest heavier than anger would have. For months earlier, I had buried my husband of 42 years. For months since I'd stood beneath a gray Rhode Island sky listening to church bells ring while people handed me casseroles and said things like he's in a better place now. I never got used to those words. Better place. As if the best place Thomas Whitmore could possibly be was anywhere other than home. After the funeral, the house became painfully quiet. Too quiet for a woman who had spent 4 decades listening to another person breathe beside her at night. I stopped using the upstairs hallway light because Thomas always used to complain about electric bills. I still cooked too much soup without realizing it. Sometimes I caught myself reaching for his coffee mug before remembering there was no reason to anymore. That was when Daniel started calling more often. My son had always been busy. Important meetings. Long hours. Endless business trips. But suddenly he was checking on me every few days. Vanessa came too, carrying blueberry muffins from that overpriced bakery downtown and asking if I was sleeping all right. Looking back now, I realize grief makes you easy to fool. It makes kindness feel bigger than it really is. "You shouldn't be alone, Mom," Daniel had told me one rainy Sunday evening while standing in my kitchen. "Just for a little while. Until things feel normal again." I remember feeling grateful. Relieved even. The thought of hearing footsteps in the house again sounded comforting back then. I thought family moved closer after loss. I didn't know some people only move closer when they see an opportunity. The first week after they moved in, everything seemed fine. Vanessa reorganized the pantry. Daniel replaced the garage light bulb Thomas never got around to fixing. We ate dinner together at the dining room table while soft jazz played from the speaker in the kitchen. Sometimes I almost believed life was settling into a gentler version of itself. Then small things started disappearing. Thomas's old flannel blanket from the living room chair. The framed wedding photo from the hallway. The ceramic bowl my mother gave me before she died. Every time I asked, Vanessa smiled politely and said she was decluttering. Then the codes changed. First the Wi-Fi password. Then the garage keypad. Then one morning I realized the security alarm no longer recognized my entry code. Technology glitches, Vanessa had explained with a laugh. I wanted to believe her because the alternative felt too ugly to consider. Now I stood on the porch while cold air slipped through my coat sleeves and realized none of it had been accidental. Behind Vanessa, I could see my dining room light glowing warmly above the table Thomas built with his own hands. I could see the curtains I hemmed myself 20 years ago. I could smell pot roast drifting faintly through the door every time the wind shifted. My home was right there. only a few feet away, but suddenly unreachable. "Please open the door," I whispered. Vanessa's expression tightened for just a second before smoothing itself back into something polite and distant. "I think it's better if you stay with a friend tonight." Then the screen went black. I stood there for a long time after that. Long enough for the milk to grow warm in the grocery bag. Long enough for the porch light to switch on automatically as evening settled across the neighborhood. A car slowed briefly while passing the house, then continued down the street. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice. Everything around me kept moving like normal while my entire life quietly rearranged itself behind a locked front door. And standing there beneath the porch light Thomas installed 27 years ago, I realized something that frightened me more than grief ever had. I no longer knew when my son had stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as something standing in the way of his future. I did not call anyone that night. Not Daniel. Not the police. Not even Evelyn Parker from across the street, who would have marched over there in her slippers and raised enough noise for the entire neighborhood to hear. Instead, I sat in my car at the far end of the grocery store parking lot with the engine running and stared at my house from 3 blocks away through a line of bare trees. The windows glowed softly against the darkening sky. Warm yellow light in the kitchen. Television flickering somewhere upstairs. For anyone passing by, it looked peaceful. Like a family settling in for the evening. I wondered if Vanessa had already thrown away the groceries I bought. The chicken. Broth. The carrots. The vanilla creamer Daniel liked in his coffee since college. My hands rested motionless on the steering wheel while the heater blew stale warm air against my face. I remember noticing how badly my fingers were trembling when I tried to turn off the windshield wipers. It had started raining sometime after sunset, a thin cold drizzle that coated the streets and turned the sidewalks silver beneath the streetlights. Rhode Island rain always carried a certain loneliness in October. Thomas used to say it made the whole world smell like wet cedar and chimney smoke. I stayed in that parking lot for almost an hour before driving to the small motel off Route 2 near Warwick. The kind with faded flower boxes outside the office and carpets that smelled faintly like bleach no matter how clean they looked. The young woman at the front desk could not have been older than 23. She smiled politely while tapping at her keyboard. "Just one night?" she asked. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I did not know. "For now," I said quietly. Room 214 overlooked the highway. I carried my 2 grocery bags upstairs myself because I could not bear the thought of anyone helping me. The room had floral curtains, a coffee maker missing the lid, and one framed painting of a lighthouse hanging crooked above the bed. I sat down slowly on the edge of the mattress and listened to the sound of traffic passing outside. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt something colder than grief settle into me. Displacement. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from realizing your absence does not inconvenience the people you sacrificed for. I thought about Daniel as a little boy standing barefoot in our backyard with grass stains on his knees and popsicle juice running down his chin. Every summer Thomas built him something new. A tire swing. A treehouse. A baseball backstop near the fence. We were not wealthy people, but that house carried decades of effort in every room. Thomas worked overtime at the utility company for years, while I cleaned offices at the elementary school in the evenings to help pay the mortgage faster. We missed vacations. Drove old cars. Repaired appliances instead of replacing them. I still remembered the winter we could only afford one Christmas gift for Daniel. A second-hand bicycle Thomas restored in the garage over 3 weekends. Daniel cried when he saw it Christmas morning. "Best bike ever," he kept saying while riding circles in the driveway. Back then, he used to hug me every day before school. Somewhere between that little boy and the man sitting in my house tonight pretending not to hear me knocking at the door, something had quietly disappeared. Around 10 o'clock, my phone finally buzzed. Daniel's name appeared across the screen. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. "Mom." His voice sounded tired. Not angry. Not emotional. Just tired. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then I heard him exhale softly. "Vanessa thinks everybody needs boundaries right now." Boundaries. Another soft modern word people use when they want cruelty to sound reasonable. "You changed the locks on your mother." "It is temporary," he replied quickly. "You have been overwhelmed since Dad died." Vanessa thought maybe some distance would help. I closed my eyes. "Did you agree with her?" Another silence. Longer this time. Somewhere in the background, I heard dishes clinking in my kitchen. My kitchen. "Mom," he said carefully, "you have not been yourself lately." I looked around the motel room at the faded curtains and the cheap lamp beside the bed. My church shoes were still damp from the rain. The grocery receipt sat folded beside me on the nightstand. $87.42. Half the items were things Daniel liked. "I buried my husband 4 months ago," I whispered. What exactly was I supposed to be? His voice hardened slightly then, not with anger but discomfort. Like someone trying to finish an unpleasant conversation quickly. "Nobody is saying you cannot come back eventually. We just need time to settle things." Settle things. I almost asked what things. But deep down, I already knew the answer had nothing to do with grief. It was about the house. The property taxes Thomas paid early every year. The rising value of homes in our neighborhood. The hardwood floors. The large backyard. The equity two younger people drowning in credit card debt would look at and see as salvation. Suddenly, every small change over the past few weeks replayed itself in my mind differently. Vanessa asking questions about the deed. Daniel casually mentioning home values at dinner. The way Vanessa once stood in the dining room and said, "This place could be beautiful with some updates." Not our home. Not your father's house. This place. I lowered the phone slowly from my ear after Daniel said goodnight. Good night. As if I were away visiting relatives instead of sitting alone in a roadside motel while strangers slept comfortably in the house where I spent 42 years building a life. I did not cry that night. I thought I would. But grief had already drained most of the tears out of me months ago beside Thomas's hospital bed. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out at the wet highway shimmering beneath the lights. Cars moved steadily through the darkness, people heading home to places where their keys still worked. And for the first time since the funeral, a quiet thought entered my mind that frightened me almost as much as losing Thomas. Maybe my husband had not been the only thing I lost this year. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of trucks moving along the highway outside the motel window. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. My eyes drifted toward the empty side of the bed automatically, searching for Thomas the way they still did some mornings. Then reality settled over me all at once. The faded motel wallpaper. The humming air conditioner. My church coat hanging from the back of a chair beside 2 grocery bags I had never unpacked. I sat up slowly and felt stiffness spread through my shoulders and lower back. 70 years old in 2 months, and suddenly homeless in everything except name. The coffee maker in the room made terrible coffee. Weak and bitter. I drank it anyway while standing near the window watching gray morning rain slide down the glass. Across the parking lot, a man in a delivery uniform scraped frost from his windshield while talking on the phone. A woman walked a small terrier past the vending machines near the office. Normal lives continuing as if the world had not quietly collapsed overnight. Around 8 o'clock, I drove back toward the neighborhood. I told myself I only wanted to pick up my medication and winter clothes. But deep down, I think I simply needed to see the house again with daylight around it, hoping somehow the entire thing would look less real. The neighborhood appeared unchanged. Halloween decorations still sat on porches up and down the street. Plastic pumpkins. Fake cobwebs fluttering in damp wind. Someone 2 houses down had hung orange lights around their maple tree. Thomas always loved this time of year. He used to buy oversized candy bars because he hated disappointing children on Halloween night. I parked across the street instead of in the driveway. My own driveway. The curtains in the living room were open now. I could see Vanessa moving around inside carrying a cardboard box. She had already started changing things. Even from the car, I could tell the bookshelf beside the fireplace looked emptier than before. Thomas's old fishing magazines were gone. The brass lamp from his office too. It felt strange how quickly people erased traces of someone once they believed ownership had changed hands. I sat there gripping the steering wheel while memories drifted through my mind in fragments. Daniel running through sprinklers in the backyard at age 8. Thomas teaching him how to rake leaves. Family Thanksgiving dinners crowded around the dining room table while snow fell softly outside. For decades, that house had held every version of our family inside it. Now I looked at it the way people look at museums dedicated to lives that no longer exist. My phone buzzed suddenly in the cup holder beside me. Evelyn Parker. I hesitated before answering because I already knew she had noticed something was wrong. Evelyn noticed everything. "Margaret," she said immediately, her voice sharp with concern. "Why was Vanessa dragging suitcases through your garage last night?" I stared at the windshield. "You saw that." "Honey, everybody saw that." I nearly marched over there myself. Evelyn had lived next door for 22 years. A retired elementary school principal with silver curls and the personality of a woman who had spent decades telling children exactly where to stand during fire drills. "Where are you?" she asked. "Just out driving." "Margaret Whitmore, do not lie to me." I closed my eyes briefly. I stayed at the Warwick Inn. Silence filled the line for one long second before Evelyn muttered something under her breath that sounded very unlike a retired school principal. "Come over here. Right now." I almost refused out of pride. But exhaustion settled heavier over me with every passing hour, and the thought of sitting alone in that motel room another night suddenly felt unbearable. Evelyn opened the front door before I even reached the porch. The smell of cinnamon oatmeal drifted through the house along with soft piano music playing somewhere in the kitchen. Warmth wrapped around me immediately after the cold rain outside. "Sit down," she said gently. "And for heaven's sake, take off that coat." I sat at her kitchen table while she poured coffee into one of those oversized mugs decorated with little autumn leaves. My hands looked pale against the ceramic. Older somehow. "Tell me everything," she said quietly. So I did. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just the facts. The locks. The camera. Daniel's phone call. The motel room. Evelyn listened without interrupting once, though I noticed her jaw tightening more with every sentence. When I finished, she leaned back slowly in her chair and stared at me for a moment. "Something is wrong here," she said finally. "More wrong than just a selfish daughter-in-law." I looked down into my coffee. Daniel sounded different. Different how? I searched for the right word. Nervous. The kitchen grew quiet except for the ticking wall clock above the refrigerator. Then Evelyn said something that made my stomach tighten instantly. "Yesterday afternoon, before all this happened, I saw a man in a suit walking through your backyard with Daniel." I looked up sharply. "What kind of man?" "Real estate type," she replied. "Leather portfolio. Fancy shoes. Measuring things." For a second, I genuinely could not speak. My eyes drifted toward the rain-speckled kitchen window while pieces of the last few weeks began fitting together in ways I had desperately tried to avoid. Vanessa asking whether Thomas ever refinanced the house. Daniel mentioning property values over dinner. The sudden urgency to move in after the funeral. The quiet way they started replacing things room by room. Evelyn reached across the table and touched my hand softly. "Margaret," she said carefully, "I do not think they planned for you to come back into that house." Something inside me turned cold then. Not grief this time. Not heartbreak. Clarity. I thought about Daniel standing in my kitchen weeks earlier telling me I should not be alone after Thomas died. I remembered the sympathy in his voice. The concern in Vanessa's smile. And suddenly I understood the cruelest part of all. They had not waited for my grief to pass before making plans around my absence. They had used it. That afternoon, I drove to St. Andrew's Cemetery without really deciding to go there. My hands simply turned the steering wheel in that direction the way they had every Sunday since Thomas died. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the roads damp and shining beneath a pale gray sky. By the time I parked near the cemetery gates, cold wind had begun stripping the last orange leaves from the trees. Autumn in Rhode Island always arrived quietly. One morning the world still looked alive, and by evening everything seemed to be preparing for sleep. I carried the small bundle of white chrysanthemums I bought from the roadside market and walked slowly across the wet grass toward Thomas's grave. The ground still looked too fresh to me. Too new. I used to think grief softened with time, but what nobody tells you is that sometimes it simply changes shape. Some days it sat in my chest like loneliness. Other days it arrived as anger. And standing there beside that headstone, I suddenly felt both. "You should be here," I whispered. The wind moved softly through the cemetery trees above me. Thomas always knew what to do. That had been his gift. He never raised his voice. Never panicked. Even during the years when money was tight and Daniel needed braces and the furnace broke 2 weeks before Christmas, Thomas always found a way to make the world feel manageable again. He used to say, "A home only stays standing if somebody keeps protecting it." At the time, I thought he was talking about roof repairs and mortgage payments. Now I understood he meant people too. I crouched down carefully and brushed damp leaves away from the base of the stone with my gloved hand. Thomas Edward Whitmore. Beloved husband. Devoted father. The dates beneath his name still looked unreal to me, as if someone else's tragedy had been carved there by mistake. "I do not understand how Daniel became this person," I said softly. Saying it aloud hurt more than I expected. Because the truth was, I had spent the last 2 days trying to convince myself Vanessa caused everything. It was easier that way. Easier to believe my son had simply been manipulated by an ambitious woman who saw opportunity in an old house and a grieving widow. But Daniel had changed the locks too. Daniel had ignored my calls while I stood outside in the cold. Daniel had listened to me ask to come home and decided I was inconvenient instead. A gust of wind pushed against my coat as I stood back up slowly. Across the cemetery, another family was gathered near a gravesite farther down the hill. A little girl held her father's hand while he adjusted flowers beside a stone marker. Watching them made my chest ache unexpectedly. I remembered bringing Daniel here once after his grandfather died. He could not have been older than 9. He asked Thomas if people got lonely underground. Thomas knelt beside him and said, "No, buddy. The people who love us carry us around with them. That is how we stay close." Back then, Daniel believed every word his father said. I stayed at the cemetery longer than I planned. Long enough for my fingers to grow numb through my gloves. Long enough for shadows to begin stretching across the grass. When I finally returned to the car, my phone showed 3 missed calls from Daniel. I stared at the screen for several seconds before listening to the voicemail. "Mom," he said, sounding tense, "Vanessa thinks maybe we should all sit down and talk calmly about this situation." Situation. Another careful word designed to smooth over something ugly. He continued speaking. "Nobody wants things to get dramatic. We are just trying to make practical decisions." Practical decisions. I leaned back against the driver's seat and closed my eyes. That phrase transported me instantly to a memory from nearly 20 years earlier. Daniel at 23, sitting at our kitchen table after college graduation with overdue bills spread out everywhere because he had maxed out 2 credit cards trying to impress friends in Boston. He looked terrified that day. Ashamed. Thomas spent an entire weekend helping him organize payment plans and build a budget. Not once did we make him feel unwanted. Not once did Thomas call him irresponsible, even though he had every right to. "Family helps family recover," my husband told him that night. That is the whole point of having one. I wondered now if Daniel remembered that conversation at all. On the drive back toward Evelyn's house, something kept bothering me. Not just the realtor Evelyn mentioned. Not just the locks. It was the speed of everything. Thomas had only been gone 4 months. For months since hospital machines beeped softly around his bed while I rubbed lotion into his dry hands because chemotherapy had cracked his skin. For months since Daniel stood beside me at the funeral pretending to cry into a folded tissue. Looking back now, even that memory felt uncertain. Had he already been planning this then? Had Vanessa already been studying the house room by room while mourners carried casseroles through the front door? The thought made my stomach tighten. When I pulled into Evelyn's driveway, I noticed a dark sedan parked beside the curb across the street from my house. A man in a navy overcoat stood near the front lawn holding a clipboard while Vanessa spoke to him beside the porch steps. She laughed at something he said. Actually laughed. The same porch where I stood locked outside less than 48 hours earlier. My hands tightened around the steering wheel again as realization settled coldly through me. They were not waiting for me to recover from grief. They were already preparing for life after me. That evening, I barely touched dinner. Evelyn made chicken and dumplings from scratch, The kind of comfort food that normally would have reminded me of snowy Sundays and family gatherings around crowded tables. But my stomach stayed tight the entire time. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted toward the kitchen window facing my house across the street. The porch light glowed warmly against the dark. Someone moved past the front window carrying what looked like one of my storage boxes. Evelyn noticed where I was looking and quietly set down her spoon. "You cannot keep torturing yourself like this," she said gently. I forced a small nod even though I could not seem to stop staring. The strange thing about betrayal is how ordinary everything around it looks. Cars still passed through the neighborhood. Mail still arrived. Porch lights still flicked on at sunset. Somewhere down the street, children laughed while chasing each other through piles of leaves. The world never pauses just because your heart does. Around 7:30, my phone rang again. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," he said carefully, "Vanessa and I want to invite you to dinner tomorrow night so we can discuss things like adults." Like adults. I almost smiled at that. I am 70 years old, Daniel. I have been an adult longer than you have been alive. Silence stretched briefly across the line. Then his voice softened slightly. "Nobody wants this to turn ugly." I leaned back slowly in the kitchen chair. "Ugly was changing the locks on your widowed mother." He exhaled heavily. "You keep saying it like we threw you onto the street." I stared at the dark kitchen window in disbelief. "Where exactly do you think I slept last night?" Another pause. I could practically hear him struggling to hold on to whatever version of the story he had been repeating to himself. "Mom, Vanessa thinks maybe you need more support than we can give you right now." There it was again. Vanessa thinks. Vanessa says. Vanessa believes. Somewhere over the years, my son had stopped speaking with his own voice. "What support?" I asked quietly. "You mean like removing me from my own house?" His tone sharpened slightly then, not angry exactly, but defensive. "The house is too much for one person now. Dad is gone. Things change. Dad is gone." Such a simple sentence for something that shattered an entire life. I looked down at my wedding ring resting against the coffee mug between my hands. 42 years together reduced to a practical discussion about square footage and property value. "Who is the man outside the house today?" I asked suddenly. Silence again. Longer this time. "What man?" "The one with the clipboard." I heard movement on his end of the call. A door closing softly somewhere in the background. Then his voice returned lower than before. "Just somebody helping us evaluate options." Evaluate options. My chest tightened quietly. Options for what? He did not answer immediately. And in that silence, I finally understood something important. Daniel was afraid. Not of me. Not of conflict. He was afraid of losing whatever future he and Vanessa had already built in their minds around my house. "You were trying to sell it," I whispered. "Mom, nobody said that." But he still did not deny it. I closed my eyes briefly as memories rose unexpectedly through the ache in my chest. Thomas sanding the kitchen cabinets by hand because custom ones cost too much. Me sewing curtains late at night after double shifts at the elementary school. Daniel asleep upstairs while we sat at the dining room table balancing bills during hard winters when heating oil prices jumped. We built that home inch by inch together. Not because it was valuable, because it was ours. "I think you should come tomorrow," Daniel said finally. "We can explain everything calmly." Explain. Such a strange word when the truth was already standing fully formed between us. After the call ended, Evelyn remained quiet for several moments before speaking. "Margaret," she said carefully, "you need legal advice." I looked over at her. "Legal advice?" Thomas used Harold Bennett for everything. Wills. Property taxes. The refinancing years ago. I had not heard Harold's name since the funeral. He and Thomas played golf together every spring for nearly 15 years. "I do not want to start a war," I admitted softly. Evelyn's expression changed then. Not angry. Just deeply sad. "Honey," she said, "I think your son already did." Later that night, after Evelyn went upstairs to bed, I sat alone in her living room wrapped in a knitted blanket while rain tapped softly against the windows. The house smelled faintly like cinnamon candles and old books. Across the street, my own bedroom light suddenly turned on upstairs. I froze. For a moment, instinct almost convinced me Thomas was walking into the room after brushing his teeth the way he always used to before bed. But then I saw Vanessa move past the curtains carrying a stack of folded towels. She had moved into my bedroom. Not the guest room downstairs. Not Daniel's old room. My bedroom. The room where Thomas held my hand during thunderstorms because I hated lightning. The room where we whispered about retirement plans at night after Daniel left for college. The room where I sat beside my husband's hospice bed during his final week alive. Something inside me finally shifted then. Until that moment, a part of me still believed this nightmare could be solved through misunderstanding, emotion, or guilt. But standing there in the dim light of Evelyn's living room while another woman walked comfortably through the most private space in my marriage, I realized the truth was far colder than grief. Vanessa was not helping herself to my home temporarily. She was replacing me inside it. The next morning, I met Harold Bennett at his office downtown. The building sat above an old pharmacy near Main Street, the same place it had been for as long as I could remember. Thomas used to joke that Harold would probably still be drafting wills there after the rest of the city floated out into the Atlantic. Walking inside felt strangely familiar. The faint smell of coffee and old paper. The quiet ticking wall clock behind the receptionist's desk. Even the burgundy carpet looked exactly the same as it had 10 years ago. Some places resist change longer than people do. Harold came around the corner carrying a legal folder beneath one arm, and for a moment, his expression softened when he saw me. "Margaret," he said gently. "I wish this visit were under better circumstances." So did I. He led me into his office overlooking the rainy street below. Framed photographs of sailboats hung on the walls beside shelves crowded with binders and legal books. Thomas always liked Harold because he never wasted words. He spoke carefully, listened fully, and treated every problem like it deserved patience instead of panic. I sat down slowly in the leather chair across from his desk while he removed his glasses and folded his hands together. "Evelyn told me what happened," he said quietly. I nodded once. Saying it aloud still felt humiliating somehow. "They changed the locks." Harold's jaw tightened slightly. "Did Daniel provide any written notice?" "No." "Any eviction paperwork?" "No." "Did your husband ever remove your name from the property?" I blinked in confusion. "Of course not." Harold opened the folder in front of him carefully. "Margaret, before Thomas passed away, he updated several estate documents." A strange feeling moved through me then. Not fear exactly. More like standing near the edge of something I could not yet see clearly. "Updated them how?" Harold studied me for a moment before answering. "Thomas was worried." I stared at him. "Worried about what?" Harold hesitated briefly, as though deciding how much truth an old widow should receive in one morning. Then he reached into the folder and slid a thick document across the desk toward me. "About this house. About pressure being placed on you after his death." For several seconds, I simply looked at the papers without touching them. "Pressure from who?" Harold did not answer immediately, which told me enough already. "About a year ago," he said carefully, "Thomas mentioned that Daniel had started asking unusual questions regarding the property." My chest tightened quietly. "What kind of questions?" "Market value. Ownership transfer procedures. Reverse mortgage structures. He asked whether the home could be sold quickly if something happened to both of you." Something cold settled beneath my ribs. I remembered those conversations now. Daniel asking casual questions during dinner while pretending interest in real estate markets. Vanessa commenting on housing prices rising in our neighborhood. At the time, Thomas brushed most of it aside with uncomfortable little laughs. I thought nothing of it. Harold continued speaking softly. "Your husband created a protected family trust. The property remains legally yours for the rest of your life. It cannot be sold, transferred, or refinanced without your direct authorization." I stared at him silently. "Daniel does not own the house?" "No," Harold replied firmly. "Not even partially." For the first time in days, I felt something shift inside me besides grief and humiliation. Confusion. Because if Daniel knew this, then changing the locks had never been about ownership. It had been intimidation. Harold leaned back slightly in his chair. "There is more." I looked up slowly. Thomas added a protective clause 6 months before his diagnosis worsened. My hands tightened together in my lap. What kind of clause? Harold opened another document. If any beneficiary attempts to remove, coerce, manipulate, or unlawfully pressure you regarding residency or property rights, that individual forfeits inheritance consideration tied to the estate. The office suddenly felt very quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking Main Street below. Somewhere outside, a siren passed faintly through traffic. Thomas did that? I whispered. Harold nodded once. He was very specific. I looked down at the documents again, but my vision blurred unexpectedly for a moment. Not because of the money. Thomas and I never cared much about money beyond stability. What broke something open inside me was the realization that my husband saw danger approaching before I did. Even while fighting cancer. Even while his own body was failing. He was still trying to protect me. Why didn't he tell me? Harold's expression softened. Because he hoped he was wrong. I closed my eyes briefly. Instantly, memories surfaced differently now. Thomas growing quiet whenever Vanessa talked about modernizing the house. The way he sometimes watched Daniel carefully during family dinners. The long private conversation they had in the garage one evening last spring that ended with Daniel leaving. Abruptly. At the time, Thomas told me it was just financial stress. Now I wondered how much he spared me from knowing while he was still alive. Harold slid another paper toward me. There is also the matter of a legal eviction. I looked at him blankly. Margaret, they cannot lock you out of your primary residence without due legal process. What they did was not only unethical. It was unlawful. Unlawful. Such a cold word for something that felt deeply personal. I lowered my gaze toward the rain-streaked window beside Harold's desk and suddenly pictured Vanessa walking comfortably through my bedroom while my suitcase sat in a motel room across town. My home reduced to leverage. My grief treated like weakness. But beneath the ache in my chest, another feeling slowly began unfolding for the first time since Thomas died. Calm. Not peace exactly. Something sharper. Because sitting there in Harold Bennett's office with legal papers spread across the desk between us, I realized my son and his wife had made one enormous mistake. They thought I was alone now. They forgot Thomas had prepared for this before he ever left me. The dinner invitation came less than 2 hours after I left Harold Bennett's office. Daniel sent a text message this time instead of calling. Maybe because written words felt safer. Easier to control. Mom, can we please have dinner tonight and clear up misunderstandings? I stared at the message while sitting in Evelyn's guest room beside the window overlooking my backyard. My backyard. Even thinking those words now carried a strange ache. The maple tree Thomas planted when Daniel turned 10 still stood near the fence line, its branches nearly bare against the gray afternoon sky. Every autumn, Thomas used to rake leaves into giant piles for neighborhood children to jump into. He always pretended to complain about the mess while secretly enjoying every minute of it. I wondered if Vanessa would cut that tree down eventually. The thought no longer felt impossible. Are you going? Evelyn asked from the doorway. I folded the phone quietly in my hands. Yes. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. After everything? I nodded once. I want to hear what they say. When they still think I know nothing. Evelyn watched me carefully for a moment before giving a slow approving nod. That, she said softly, sounds exactly like Thomas. By 6 o'clock, rain clouds had settled low across the neighborhood again. I parked along the curb instead of pulling into the driveway. The porch light glowed warmly against the damp evening darkness, while soft music drifted faintly through the front windows. Anyone passing by would have thought a family dinner was about to begin. In some ways, I suppose it was. Just not the kind any of us expected. Vanessa opened the front door before I knocked. She wore cream-colored slacks and a pale sweater I recognized immediately because it used to belong to me. Thomas bought it for me during a trip to Vermont nearly 15 years earlier. For one brief second, my eyes rested on the fabric before I forced them away. Vanessa smiled politely. Margaret. Thank you for coming. Margaret. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Whitmore anymore. Just Margaret. As though she had already rewritten the hierarchy inside my own home. The smell of rosemary chicken drifted from the kitchen as I stepped inside. Everything looked almost normal at first glance. But not quite. My framed family photographs were gone from the hallway table. The antique clock Thomas restored by hand sat missing from the staircase wall. Even the living room furniture had been rearranged so the couch now faced away from the fireplace entirely. It no longer felt like a home built by memory. It felt staged. Daniel appeared near the dining room entrance looking exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes, and his shirt sleeves were rolled unevenly as though he had dressed in a hurry. "Mom," he said quietly. For a moment, neither of us moved toward the other. Then he gestured awkwardly toward the table. "Dinner's ready." We ate beneath the soft yellow light of the chandelier Thomas installed himself one summer after watching 3 online tutorials and nearly electrocuting himself twice in the process. Back then, we laughed until tears rolled down our faces while he stood on a ladder insisting he absolutely knew what he was doing. Now the same light fell across. A table filled with tension so thick it nearly hummed. Vanessa spoke first. "We all care about each other here," she began smoothly. "That is important to remember." I folded my napkin carefully in my lap without responding. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, things have been emotional since Dad passed." "For all of us," Vanessa added quickly. "Emotional." Another soft word covering something ugly underneath. I looked around the dining room slowly. My dining room. The curtains I sewed by hand 20 years ago still framed the windows. Thomas's old jazz records sat stacked neatly near the stereo cabinet. But somehow every familiar object now felt distant, like relics from someone else's life. "Who is the realtor?" I asked quietly. Both of them froze. Vanessa recovered first. "Excuse me." "The man with the clipboard." Daniel glanced toward her briefly before lowering his eyes to his plate. Tiny movements reveal truth faster than words ever do. "We were only exploring possibilities," Vanessa said carefully. "For the future." I nodded slowly as if considering this reasonably. And in this future, where exactly was I supposed to go? Silence settled heavily across the table. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, floorboards creaked faintly beneath the heat turning on. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Mom, nobody wants to force you anywhere. You changed the locks." His jaw tightened. "Because things were becoming unstable." Unstable. I almost laughed at the cruelty hidden inside that word. "I attended church and bought groceries, Daniel. I did not exactly disappear into the wilderness." Vanessa placed her wine glass down carefully. "Margaret, this house is simply too large now. Maintaining it alone at your age is unrealistic." At your age. There it was. Not concern. Not grief. Reduction. The quiet way people begin speaking when they want an older person to feel smaller than their own life. I looked directly at her for the first time that evening. And yet somehow it became manageable once you moved into my bedroom. The color drained slightly from her face. Daniel looked up sharply. "Mom," but I continued calmly. "You sleep on the left side now?" Vanessa blinked at me silently. "That was Thomas's side," I said softly. Nobody spoke after that. The room grew painfully still except for the sound of silverware resting untouched against plates. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw uncertainty flicker briefly across Vanessa's expression. Because until that moment, they thought grief had made me weak. They had not realized grief was beginning to make me impossible to fool. After dinner, I stood slowly from the table and carried my untouched plate toward the kitchen sink out of habit more than politeness. For 42 years, cleaning up after meals had been part of the rhythm of my life. Thomas drying dishes beside me while jazz music played softly from the radio. Daniel sneaking bites of dessert before permission. Ordinary moments that once felt so permanent, I never imagined they could disappear. Vanessa stepped beside me quickly. "You do not need to do that," she said, reaching for the plate. Her voice sounded careful now. Controlled. I handed it over without argument and dried my hands on the dish towel hanging near the sink. It was mine too. The pale blue towel set I bought last spring during a sale downtown. Seeing my own things in someone else's hands had become strangely exhausting. Daniel hovered awkwardly near the dining room doorway as though unsure which side of the conversation he belonged on anymore. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe we should sit in the living room." I nodded once and followed them. The furniture still looked wrong to me. Vanessa had angled the couch toward the television instead of the fireplace, turning the room into something colder and less intimate. Thomas always believed fireplaces should be the center of a home because people faced each other instead of screens. Families disappear when they stop looking at one another, he used to say. Now I wondered if he saw this ending coming long before I did. Vanessa sat carefully in the armchair nearest the window while Daniel remained standing beside the mantel. Rain streaked softly against the glass outside. Somewhere upstairs, the heating system clicked on with a low hum. The house still sounded like home even, while strangers slowly hollowed it out around me. Daniel folded his arms tightly. "Mom, we know you're upset." I looked at him quietly. "Upset is when somebody forgets your birthday, Daniel." His expression tightened immediately. Vanessa stepped in before he could answer. Nobody wanted this situation to become emotional. Emotional. That word again. As though grief, betrayal, and humiliation were inconveniences instead of consequences. I sat calmly on the edge of the couch and folded my hands together in my lap. "Then perhaps you should not have locked me out of my own house." Silence followed. Heavy this time. The kind that settles when people realize excuses are beginning to collapse under their own weight. Finally, Vanessa inhaled carefully and straightened slightly in her chair. "Margaret, we are trying to think long-term here." Long-term. The housing market is strong right now. This property alone could set all of us up comfortably. Property. Not home. Never home. Daniel finally spoke again, though he still would not quite meet my eyes. "Mom, maintaining a place this size by yourself does not make financial sense anymore." I studied him quietly. There were traces of Thomas in his face still. The shape of his jaw. The tiredness around his eyes when stressed. But the warmth that once lived there seemed buried beneath anxiety and ambition now. "How much debt are you in?" I asked softly. Both of them froze. Vanessa recovered first, but only barely. "That is not relevant." "It is very relevant if you are trying to sell my house." Daniel rubbed a hand across his forehead. For the first time all evening, he looked less defensive and more exhausted. Things got difficult after the consulting firm lost 2 clients this year. Vanessa shot him a sharp glance, but he kept speaking. "We fell behind on some things." Fell behind. Such a gentle phrase for desperation. I remembered another rainy evening 20 years earlier when Daniel came home after wrecking his first car because he was texting while driving. He sat at this very fireplace terrified to tell us the insurance deductible would wipe out his savings. Thomas never yelled. He simply sat beside our son and helped him figure out a plan. "Mistakes can be repaired," my husband said that night. "Character is what matters afterward." I wondered now what Thomas would say if he saw the man standing in front of me tonight. Vanessa crossed her legs carefully and lowered her voice into something softer. Almost sympathetic. "Margaret, nobody wants you struggling alone at your age. There are beautiful retirement communities near Providence with gardens and activities and medical support." I stared at her for several seconds before speaking. "You toured them already, did you not?" Her face changed instantly. Just a flicker. But enough. Daniel looked sharply toward her. "Vanessa?" She recovered quickly. "I was only researching possibilities." Possibilities. Another polished word hiding ugliness underneath. I leaned back slowly against the couch cushions and looked around the room one more time. My room. My memories. My marriage. Reduced to a future investment opportunity discussed over wine and polite conversation. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel sat down heavily in the chair across from me and suddenly looked smaller somehow. Not younger. Smaller. "Mom," he said quietly, "you do not understand how bad things became." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Vanessa's eyes flashed toward him immediately, but he continued anyway. "We were drowning." I watched him carefully. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something underneath the rehearsed explanations and defensive language. Fear. Real fear. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing status. Money. Control. The kind of fear people carry when their entire life has been built on appearances they can no longer afford. "So you decided to take my home," I said softly. Daniel lowered his head without answering. And in that silence, everything finally became clear. This was never about helping me after Thomas died. It was never about family healing or concern for my loneliness. My grief had simply arrived at the exact moment they needed something valuable enough to save themselves. Vanessa looked toward me carefully then, studying my face as though searching for weakness. But grief had already burned most of that away months ago beside a hospital bed. What remained now was something much harder to manipulate. Because while they were busy treating me like an obstacle, they still believed I was powerless. They had no idea that tomorrow morning Harold Bennett would begin undoing everything they thought they had already won. The following morning arrived cold and painfully clear after 3 straight days of rain. Frost clung to the edges of Evelyn's front lawn, turning the grass silver beneath the pale November sunlight. I stood at the kitchen sink holding a mug of coffee while watching steam rise against the window glass. Across the street, my house looked almost peaceful in the early morning light. Vanessa's car sat in the driveway beside Daniel's truck, both parked exactly where Thomas and I used to leave ours every evening after work. Strange how quickly people settle into lives they have not earned. At 9 o'clock sharp, Harold Bennett's black sedan pulled quietly against the curb outside. He stepped out carrying a leather briefcase beneath one arm and gave me a small nod through the windshield. Calm. Prepared. Certain. The same look Thomas used to wear before difficult conversations. Evelyn squeezed my shoulder gently as I reached for my coat. "You ready?" she asked softly. I glanced one last time toward the house across the street. My house? I think I finally am. The air outside carried that sharp coastal cold unique to Rhode Island mornings near winter. Leaves scraped softly along the sidewalk while Harold and I crossed the street together. The porch steps creaked beneath my shoes exactly the same way they always had. Thomas kept promising to fix that third step every autumn, then somehow forgetting once football season started. Tiny memories waited everywhere inside that house. Hidden in sounds, smells, scratches on walls. It hurt realizing Daniel and Vanessa saw none of it. To them, it was square footage and market value. Harold knocked firmly 3 times. Footsteps moved quickly inside. Then the front door opened, and Vanessa's expression shifted almost instantly the moment she saw Harold standing beside me. "Good morning," he said politely. "I am Harold Bennett, legal representative for Margaret Whitmore." Vanessa blinked once before forcing a tight smile. "Daniel is not dressed yet." "That is perfectly all right," Harold replied calmly. "This will only take a few moments." Daniel appeared behind her seconds later wearing jeans and a wrinkled sweatshirt, his face pale the instant he recognized Harold. "Mr. Bennett?" Harold opened his briefcase carefully and removed several documents clipped neatly together. "Daniel Whitmore, these papers serve as formal notice regarding unlawful exclusion from protected residential property." Silence fell heavily across the doorway. Vanessa's face lost color first. Daniel simply stared at the papers without moving. Harold continued speaking in the same calm, measured tone. "The residence located at 14 Maplewood Lane remains solely protected under the Whitmore Family Trust established by Thomas Whitmore prior to his death. Margaret Whitmore retains full lifetime residential authority under said trust." Daniel swallowed hard. "What?" Harold handed him the documents. "Additionally, any attempt to coerce, displace, manipulate, or unlawfully remove Margaret Whitmore from residency triggers forfeiture clauses tied to inheritance distributions outlined under trust protections." Vanessa stepped forward sharply then. "That is ridiculous." Harold looked at her evenly. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. It is legally binding." The porch grew quiet except for distant traffic somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Daniel lowered his eyes slowly toward the paperwork in his trembling hands. I watched realization move across his face piece by piece. Confusion first, then disbelief, then fear. Real fear this time. "Dad never told me this existed," he whispered. Harold's expression softened only slightly. "Your father hoped these protections would never become necessary." Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "So, what exactly are you threatening us with?" "Threatening." Another revealing word. Harold removed his glasses calmly. "At the moment, Nothing. However, changing locks on an occupied legal resident without due process constitutes unlawful eviction under Rhode Island housing law. Daniel looked up sharply. "You're saying Mom could sue us?" Harold paused carefully before answering. "I am saying your mother has significantly more restraint than most people would under these circumstances." Daniel looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time in weeks. Perhaps months. And suddenly he seemed to understand what he had actually done. Not financially. Personally. The woman standing in front of him was not an obstacle between him and a real estate transaction. I was the person who sat awake through childhood fevers. The person who packed lunches at 6 in the morning for 18 years. The person who held his hand during thunderstorms after Thomas traveled for work. Grief had stripped away my illusions, but apparently it had stripped away his excuses too. "Mom," he said weakly, "I did not think." "No," I replied quietly. "You did not." Vanessa's voice sharpened instantly beside him. "Daniel, do not start acting guilty now." Harold closed his briefcase slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore will be returning home today." Vanessa laughed once under her breath. Short and cold. "You cannot honestly expect us to just leave." Harold met her gaze calmly. "Actually, legally speaking, I can." The silence afterward felt enormous. A leaf skidded across the porch between us in the wind. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started humming faintly despite the cold weather. Ordinary sounds continuing around the collapse of a family. Daniel lowered himself slowly onto the porch bench near the door as though his legs no longer trusted him. "We were desperate," he whispered. I looked at him quietly for several seconds. "Your father was desperate many times," I said softly. "But he never once solved his problems by betraying family." That sentence seemed to hit harder than anything Harold said about trusts or lawsuits. Daniel's eyes filled instantly with shame before he looked away. Vanessa remained standing rigid beside the doorway, still trying to hold on to control through anger, because anger was easier than accountability. But I no longer felt intimidated by her. People lose much of their power once you finally understand what drives them. And standing there beneath the porch light, Thomas installed with his own hands nearly 3 decades earlier, I realized Vanessa had never truly wanted this family. She wanted security, status, stability purchased through somebody else's sacrifice. The cruelest part was that Daniel had followed her so far into fear and greed that he almost forgot who raised him. Almost. But not completely. Because as Harold handed him the final document outlining the inheritance forfeiture clause, my son's shoulders collapsed in a way I had never seen before. And in that moment, I knew something important. Losing the house had terrified him. But losing the last piece of his father's respect frightened him even more.